Welcome to the Art of Conscious Living TV. I'm so very pleased to have in the studio today Stephen Jenkinson. He is from Canada and he is a spiritual activist and author. They have made many different documentaries about him. He also deals with palliative care, the art of conscious dying and living. And he likes to be known as a farmer. So we're going to be talking about that and so much more. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So you're on a great tour right now across America. You're going to LA next.
I guess so. I'm losing track. That's what happens in a tour.
Yes. So tell me, what do you actually do on the tours? So what is it, a lecture or is it a hands-on workshop, experiential, or?
It's a concert, I suppose. That's the best way to characterize it. I suppose the job is to, the one I've given myself, is to be troubled aloud. So that's what I do. I'm troubled aloud. I don't whine or complain, and it's not my trouble, personally speaking. But given everything I saw when I worked in the death trade, to be troubled by the way it is, and to be haunted by the understanding that it could be otherwise.
You said the death trade?
Death trade, yeah.
Oh, the death trade.
Death.
Death trade.
Trade,
Okay.
yeah.
So that's a palliative care.
Oh, I said death trade is the proper way of
Okay.
referring to it. It's the most honest rendering of what actually the whole enterprise is. I know people call it palliative care and other things, but the death trade is a perfectly legitimate understanding of
Right.
what it is.
So one of your other interviews, you were mentioning that you are an outsider of that. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, now they won't have me.
Why is that?
Well, I'm not a good idea for the powers that be in the death trade. You know, I wonder about what passes for common wisdom and compassion and, you know, practice and the rest. I wonder about it and probably take it to task, and it would be very hard to proceed as institutions are wont to do and have me in the mix. You know, and I understand it, sure.
Right. Well,
Makes
there was
sense.
a period of time where you were counseling. You were the head counselor
Yeah.
to doctors and nurses in the palliative care, and you were counseling them on to be conscious during the process of dying, a subject that in society they don't really talk about. It's really, we walk around as if we're not going to die. It's a subject that nobody wants to talk about. And I also, somebody asked you, of all the people that were dying and that you sat with, what common trait did they have? And it was that wrenched anxiety was going on.
Wretched anxiety.
A
yeah.
wretched anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that wretched anxiety, let's talk about that. Why do you think they have that?
Well, let's trace it back from how do I know
Yes.
that they had that, because nobody told me this about themselves, right? This is something you have to exercise tremendous observation and a real patient take on things before you scramble trying to do something, change something that you don't understand. So, very simply, everybody would claim, if you were to do any kind of a survey, that they know that they're going to die, that there's nothing news about this. Nobody's in the dark, apparently, about it. Oh, I guess there's a few people on the fringe, but otherwise the rest of us are fairly clear on the subject, if we're asked. Well, I was there when people were dying, and I have to tell you, most people were shocked. Most people were appalled. Most people were offended at the prospect of them being told that they were dying, not going to die, dying. And you go one step further and you observe that dying people are the greatest per capita consumers of sedation in the general population in North America. Ask yourself why, if everybody knows they're going to die, why are so many people sedated while they're dying? And I'm suggesting to you it's because very few people know that they're going to die.
So there's an ultimate thread of great denial going on, and not acceptance.
Well, that's not the kind of language I use, and I don't think it's very helpful.
Okay. So what language
deny
would
sounds
you
very,
use?
very active.
Okay.
Like people have decided they're going to set that one aside. I don't think in reality that's what happens at all. What happens much more emphatically is the dominant culture sees to it that nobody's obliged to know that they're going to die and to proceed accordingly. Take one little example. Let's imagine that you're in the middle of a national election. And then you observe people, what they actually say, what they're pitching you as to what's important, what's true, what's mandatory. And you take that kind of stuff and compare it to the reality of your own death and ask you which of the two, well, how can you maintain the distracted madness of one when you know apparently full well that you're going to die? After all, shouldn't knowing you're going to die help you decide what's important, what's vital, what isn't? Surely it should. It should sort of cue you up to where you might pour your life energy and your focus and so on. All I'm asking people to consider is there's not much of a sign that people's lives are informed by the realities of their dying. So that's not really denial, it's subtler,
right.
But it's much more programmatic, meaning it's in the culture at large. It's not in individual people's poor understanding of what's to become of them.
Right.
Yeah.
So as I'm listening to you speak, what's coming up is that people are not putting a focus, they're not putting an attention on that. So it's just quite as simple as that. If there's no attention put on that they're going to die, then there's no preparation, there's no awareness of it, and they're not prepared at all when it actually does happen.
Certainly they're not prepared, but there's a reward system in effect in the dominant culture of North America on these matters. Can you imagine what kind of a thrill you'd be to have at a party if you proceeded as if you knew you were going to die? Can you imagine how much small talk you'd be capable of? How much kind of goofy banter? You see, I'm suggesting to you, maybe not. It doesn't mean, I'm not talking about you'd become deathly serious all the time. I simply mean that you'd be haunted by what's important, what is not. And you'd be surrounded by people who have no such disturbance. How do you think you'd fit in? So that's what I mean. The reward system is very clear. The more distracted you are, the more affable you become, the easier you are to be around. You might imagine I'm speaking from personal experience here too.
Yes.
So having seen as many people die as I have, hundreds and hundreds, when I was in the job, it is not easy to talk nonsense with strangers subsequent to that. So the reward system is much clearer that there's no willingness to proceed as if the gravity of your life comes from its ending. But that's where it comes from its ending. And your life is played out in the presence of its end, which is to say then that knowing this ending is probably the only reliable thing that gives you a chance to wonder big things, to take enormous risk. I don't mean, rock climbing. I mean real risk with your sanity, with your status in the community and so on. There's something about endings that gives you the chance to choose such things instead of being driven towards them by desperation or by a sense of futility.
So when you speak about the reward, as it is, the reward is to die quietly and don't make a big fuss about it. And
you could go further. The reward is not to die at all.
Oh.
To just kind of vaporize. There are some famous books about dying out there, and when you look at the examples that are held forward as the ones to emulate, almost without exception, the standard that you'd be held to as a reader of such books is the less dying, the quieter dying, the subtler dying, the better. That's a very strange recipe for profound, achieved, skillful dying. I mean, ask yourself this. Let's imagine that you're, let's say, a tennis player. And I would ask you, do you enjoy it? You say, yeah. I say, do you practice? You're trying to get better. You say, well, of course. And I'd say, why? And you might say, well, it's kind of self-evident. If I'm enjoying it, then getting good at it would be one of the ways to enjoy it even more, right? So if you're getting good at being able to die well, is it so that you die less? Is that what the skillfulness is for? Because that's the reward system. Even in the context of palliative care, the reward system is the less dying, the better. And generally speaking, all of this mantra of acceptance and so on is drawn into the project of your dying being a minor keyed, not very significant part of the ending of your days.
Right. Well, the doctors don't even handle death very well either. It's kind of like that's not their job. Their job is to be focused on keeping you alive at all costs, whether it's machines and drugs and whatever technology. But let me ask you, Stephen, what do you think it would be a good death? How would you like yourself to die? How do you see yourself dying, and to be an example for others? Let's speak about that. Would there be consciousness to it?
I can work backwards from all the bad deaths I saw that inform my understanding, my answer to that question.
Please.
Every bad death I saw, and this might surprise you, was not characterized by rampaging symptoms or uncontrolled pain or all the side effects, or none of that. That was there sometimes it was not there. Every bad death I saw was small, inward turned, self-absorbed and preoccupied. Dying people proceeded as if they owned this thing called their dying. They circled the wagons, family and close friends only. In a word then, every bad death I saw corroded people's capacity for something I've come to call a kind of village-mindedness, a kind of large, inclusive, slightly untamed or undomesticated proposition. The few good deaths I saw, relatively speaking, they were few, but every one of them was somehow large. I don't mean like Italian family wedding large. I mean, it had a kind of vibrancy to it that wouldn't tolerate people being folded in on it or collapsed in on it. It pushed by including somehow. It broke it strained against the normal barriers of privacy and self-containment. I was extremely inspired by the relatively few good deaths I saw. So I suppose my vision of it would be that a lot of people have a lot to do. That in that sense, it's a messy and disordered proposition. And if people have a lot to do, is it not possible that they may learn something that would become valuable to them when it's their turn? In other words, one of the things I learned is the only way to learn dying well is not by keeping it at a distance. Not yours, not someone close to you, not anybody's. Anyone's death before your own. That's your chance to get it right.
And what do you do with that death of somebody that you so love, your parents, your sister, your lover, your husband? There's no attachment there, and you open up to the acceptance that there was birth, there's life, and that it's a process of death. So it's going to happen. So we have to see that there's a continuum, that life is death and death is a continuum. And it's not to take it so personal, that we're all in this together.
Well,
and we're open to that.
I don't. This is not what I work with anyway. This take on it, as you've described it. I mean, dying people are absolutely entitled, and I would say obligated, to be enormously sad about the fact that they're dying, to wish they weren't dying while they are, would have it otherwise if they could. I mean, this mania of acceptance I don't think it does anyone any good. I was exposed to a lot of dying now. I myself have had some brushes with it also. So I know it at this level also. And I would just ask you to consider that that living is very habit forming once you taste the possibility of not living. It doesn't make you insane. It doesn't necessarily make you desperate at all. Glimpsing your own death by attending the death of other people can give you an appetite for being alive that is serious, and it doesn't give way easily. And I don't expect that I'm going to say, oh well, I've seen enough dying, so I guess it's my turn. Oh well, I don't think so. I mean, I rail against it even now.
So if it's not acceptance,
Yeah.
is it witnessing? Is it, I'm just trying to unpack it to find out exactly
Loving
the
being
process
alive
of it.
doesn't include accepting that your life is ending when it is.
So is it just watching it, witnessing it, seeing it, and being okay with that? And
No, not okay. It's a very strange angle that you're. I know you're not speaking on your own behalf because I'm well aware that this is out there. All these ideas of acceptance and
well,
this
I
kind
have,
of.
I have my understanding of it, but I'm also trying to probe for the viewer who I'm very aware that they are not wanting to even listen to this subject that we're speaking about.
Sure.
So the questions I'm asking you are mindful that if they did want to speak about this and were contemplating it, they would be wondering about these questions, and they want to know what to do with that when a loved one has just died and they're just so raw and they're in the throes of great emotion and pain. What else can they do there with that? And being that you wrote the book Die Wise, which I like to speak about, and unpack that of what we can discover here.
It's learning. In a word, that's what we're talking about.
Learning.
You have no obligation to know about death prior to being around it, prior to being close to it. How could you possibly know anything about this vast and uncharted mystery called the end of something that you've grown so accustomed to that you never really seriously pictured it ending, whether it's yours or somebody you've married or you feel very close to? Learning is the unwelcome encounter with things that you thought you knew, you see. That's what learning is. Learning is very hard on your belief system, on all your habits, and so on. And that's the gorgeous and heartbreaking thing about all endings, and dying is a pretty good example of endings, that it calls so deeply into question what you've grown accustomed to, that the first reaction could be, and often is in a culture like ours, something like trauma. I mean, it's a much stronger word than trouble or sorrow. Trauma. Many people come to their dying time, their terminal diagnosis, as a trauma-inducing thing, and they're treated for PTSD, for God's sake, about something that was always true. You were always going to die. Now you have some affirmation, and this constitutes some kind of traumatic, unnatural intrusion into the natural order of things called what you've grown accustomed to.
I think children would be better at handling death than adults.
Depends on their age.
Depends on their age. But I'm talking
Because
about the
they
very young
learn
ones.
what we're talking about right now.
Right.
Not at 15.
Right.
There's somewhere, in my experience, I worked with a lot of kids who died, and I can tell you, up until about, in general terms, something like 7 to 9,
Yes.
somewhere in there, up until then, they are more drawn in by the reactions of the people around them to their dying than they are to their own dying. Absolutely. And they interact with people, with other people, not with their dying per se. I can tell you this, that the greatest sorrow that gathered around dying children didn't come from the children, of course, it came from their parents principally. And their parents' great grievance about the death of their children was that their kids would not get to live a full life. That was the principal grievance, the grave injustice was not getting to live a full life. So what I would do is I would tell them, wait here, I will go down to the kids' room, I would ask these kids, your parents are concerned that you're not going to live a full life. Will you? Have you? You have to explain the idea of a full life to a 7-year-old. Do you know why? Not because they're simple, not because they're children, but because that's the only kind of life they're capable of, is a full life. That's the very life they've had until 7 or 8 or 9 years old. And then they begin to learn there's this thing called potential, the future, the should, the kind of life you're entitled to, that you deserve, that is your right. And once that learning kicks in, that's where the grievance comes from. How mysterious.
Would the word experiential be appropriate? When you say learning, I think of being open, experiential. That's how I would learn. To see.
Well, what else is there?
Right, to be in the moment of that experience, to not be resisting it, not be pushing it away, and not to be in the throes of it, but yet to be open to it. So that to me would equate to experiential, of somebody else dying, and also of your own death.
Openness is, I think, is a skill. You know, it's not a reflex.
It's definitely a learned skill.
It's a skill.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of work to learn something like what you've described. And work means practice, and practice means you have to be there. You can't practice it in the privacy of your own mind to be open to these things. But again, I'm not persuaded that openness in and of itself has such great value. If you use a parallel courtship, romantic courtship, and you know, how does that work? Is it a headlong flight in one direction, and it never veers or varies, and there's no hesitation? None of that's true. Of course there's hesitation. Lust, there's very little hesitation, but deep romantic courtship has momentum to it that includes doubling back, that includes wondering about it, that includes slowing down. You see what I'm saying? It's not a roller coaster.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I mean about learning dying. It has all those attributes to it. So you're under no obligation to understand that you must somehow be okay with dying.
So let's backtrack to what we spoke about a moment ago, that somebody's loved one dies, or somebody's sister or father, somebody's loved. And is that a time you mentioned to start practicing at that moment your own death? You're bringing your own awareness in there, becoming familiar with death, and the learning starts right there.
No, I wouldn't say so.
No?
I would say the word I'd use here to describe what you're imagining here is endings, not death in the narrower, specific sense of the death of this particular person. When someone close to you dies, almost regardless of your age, the thing you're encountering here principally is not your own death in the future. Because if that's where you go with it, the question is up for grabs whether or not you're engaged with the reality of the dying of this person close to you. Automatically becomes part of your future? I don't think so. And I don't think that's really becoming of us.
So what is
So I'm talking about endings instead. So dying is not the only ending, of course not. I mean, divorce does a very good imitation of death, frankly. If you've ever been through it, anybody who's been through it knows that the degree of kind of desertification of the soul that divorce can be, it's a very good training ground for dying. Endings of all kinds bring this understanding towards you and give you a chance to become somewhat acquainted with it, even though you'd never choose to do so. I mean, that's the key thing. You have no obligation to feel that this is a good idea for you, or that it'd be good for your mental health or for the state of your soul. Not at all. And the gorgeousness of the arrangement is that it's in the nature of dying that these things will come to you whether you seek them or whether you don't. There's some mercy in the arrangement, you see. If it was left to us, up to us to decide that learning about our own death was good for us, what are the likelihoods that most of us would do so? I don't think so. So the good news is that life is full of endings. It's full of limitation. Fortunately, the dominant culture of North America detests limitation, detests endings, hates things that you don't get a vote on, that you don't get a choice on. And this is why we're not very good at dying when it's our turn.
Stephen, I'm going to return back to the question, how, when your moment of death comes, how do you see you having a good death?
Yeah,
what would that be like?
Well, you know,
the people around you?
Yeah, I'd be a small player in the arrangement, wouldn't I?
Yes.
Because where does my death happen? Does it happen in my
your physical
my body?
Yes.
Not very much. Not the scale of the kind of endings that we're talking about now can't be contained by the physical realities of the person who's dying. You've already been asking about them. There are, you know, people who know you. There are people who care about you, very attached to you, and so on. Your death is happening there too. This is far beyond, you know, the metabolic realities of your own body, you see. And the meaning of your dying is not something that you, the dying person, really determines very much. What it means for you to be dying is in the heart and in the language and in the sorrow of the people who know of your dying around you, you see. That's where its real meaning is happens and is determined and is responded to.
So what thoughts will be going on with you? What thoughts would you like to be going on at your moment?
You're very kind to imagine that I'm going to have this kind of expertise available to me in those days, in those moments.
Yes.
I'm not persuaded that I will. And I don't think I should imagine myself as having to go into my dying as some kind of pro. You see.
So that you have it perfect and others don't, and you have it a little bit more perfect than...
I don't mean perfect, just even like really
familiarity
notorious,
with it.
You know, really something that is somehow inherently immensely valuable to other people simply because of the books I wrote or the things that I talked about. Or I don't think so. Look, as much as I've seen, I know full well that I'll come to my dying in some fashion or other as an amateur, because it happens to be my turn. So I don't have a lot of experience about it being my turn. I do have a lot of experience seeing other people coming to that time or refusing to do so. But when it's my turn, I hope my capacity is partly to being awestruck and to being utterly heartbroken, as well as to be able to say, you know what, I don't know if you've heard the story, but the Dalai Lama was being interviewed in some documentary I saw, and the guy said to him, so how do you feel about the Chinese? Anticipating that he'd have some hard feelings about the Chinese. And he said, when I think of the Chinese, I say, my friend, the enemy. And I suppose on my good days while I'm dying, that's probably what it'll be. My friend, the enemy. My adversary who's always been there, who, as much as I learned, still has caught me unawares. I imagine there'll be some kind of poetic justice to the fact that I talked about this stuff for so many years. And when it's my turn, I'll go, what? That'll probably be in there too.
Let's talk about the book of Wise Death.
Die Wise.
Dies Wise. Okay.
Okay, you first.
Well, why did you write this book? And what is it all about?
Because I suspected at the time that I was dying.
Okay.
Yeah. I having tremendous breathing problems, living up north. The cold extremely hard on my lungs, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. I just came from a respirologist, told me I had 1/3 normal lung capacity. So I decided, even though I'm a good Canadian, but I had no intent to die freezing in the dark, you know, in February. If that's what was happening, I preferred to have a little warmth, a little creaturely comfort, if I could manage any at all. Ended up in this small town in Mexico. And I sat there. The first morning I was there, I was about 5:30 in the morning, and the sun was just coming up. It's a mysterious place, an exotic place that I didn't belong in. And I thought to myself, what does a married man do at a time like this, anticipating that there'd be people who would be being in touch with my wife after I died, asking her, what has he written, what is there, you know, is there more, etc., and all of that. And so I realized maybe what I could do in whatever time is left to me, and energy and so on, breath, I would try to write down what I learned so nobody would have to ask her for something. It would kind of be there. I didn't really imagine it turning into a book. But 400 pages later, I wrote it in 3 weeks, about 3 weeks, every day for about 7 hours. So at some level, that's why I wrote it, because I was drawing nigh to the time when I wouldn't be able to write or say anything. Now, obviously, my diagnostic skills are not the best, because here I sit, you know, opposite you a year and a half, well, about 2 years later, and I wasn't quite right about the timing, but it was good practice. And I saw a lot coming then, and I'm not free of the breathing problems I had then, but I've been granted apparently a little more time. And this teaching and so on is what I'm doing with the more time I was granted.
And what's the overview of the book? Is it breaking down into different sections or chapters?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's, well, 400 pages. You're not going to throw 400 pages at somebody without
right.
interrupting them, you know?
Okay.
I would say the gist of it is, first of all, I'm wondering, how did it come to be as it is? Second of all, I'm articulating what people are likely to encounter, particularly at the hands of the healthcare system, when their health begins to suggest that it's never coming back to be as it once was. And then thirdly, I'm trying to answer a question that a doctor asked me one time in a teaching session that I did. I used the term death phobia to characterize the dominant culture of North America. He asked me, where did it come from? In other words, have people always been as terrified to die and as unwilling to die as the current regime might suggest? And I knew instantly the answer was no. No, it hasn't always been this way. And it's not this way with every person in North America. Of course it's not. But I think people listening recognize the realities of what I've been talking about so far. So the last third of the book is my attempt to answer sort of culturally and historically where these great torments that have been gathering around dying have come from. That's basically the thrust of the book.
Wonderful. Sounds like a must-read. It's getting a lot of great
Well, it was
reviews.
a must-write for me anyway.
Must-write.
It was a must-write,
Yes.
and I've read it a time or two since it came out. And if this doesn't sound too indelicate, I've been impressed from time to time with some of the things that are in there. And I didn't really quite remember writing them, but you know, in a 3-week period, immense things can run through you. It's not entirely clear that they come from you. They might have come to me.
Through you.
Instead,
Yeah.
rather than to me as if they were, quote, my own. I don't think everything in there was quite my own. Some of it was straight up gift, you know, and to be on the receiving end of something vital to your own life, that's not a bad arrangement. That's what happened.
Right. Let's talk about the great change in your life that happened. You became a farmer. That happened somewhere around 2008 or...
Yeah.
And before you were in the city, and now you're out there in the Ottawa Valley, and you arrived there and you figured, well, what am I going to do with this? So it kind of opened up, and now it opened up into inviting people from all over the world to come to you, and they get to honor what sacredness is and spirit is and land is and the farm and the turning of the seasons and just planting and being. So
Well, it's not quite the way you're describing it. I think there's two separate things here. There's the farm I have, and I farmed there.
yes,
There's a school. I think you're alluding to what we do in the school here.
Yes.
And the school is not ongoing, you know, people are there 10 months of the year or something.
and that's orphan.
The Orphan Wisdom School,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
I do the school at the farm, that's true.
Okay.
But it's a very contained, you know, 5 intense days at a time. So nobody's living at the farm, you know, just to be clear.
Okay.
And but this somehow the tempo of the farm seasonally, in terms of the animals and their life arc and so on, all of those things do deeply influence the momentum and the tone of how the school happens. And we feed people who come to the school from the farm as well. So nobody, when they come to the school, are very far away from these realities. I'd like to tell you a little story. I was interviewed in a magazine called The Sun, I think it's called, last year. A lot of people have seen it and been in touch with me subsequently.
Is that the Toronto Sun?
No, it's called The Sun. It's out of North Carolina, I think.
Okay. Okay.
And let's imagine the interview was this long. It's, I don't know, 12 pages or something. Somewhere in there, the interviewer asked me, do you have a spiritual practice? And how would you describe it? And I said to him something like, probably not in the way that you mean spiritual practice, but I farm every day that I'm there, and that imposes upon you a kind of discipline of the soul, you would say, because you're responsible to and responsive to the living things that are in your care. My spiritual practice, though it's not a term I would use, is to proceed to keep up my end of the arrangement I have with the animals. And that includes, of course, since they're domesticated animals, they have no natural predator to keep them healthy. My responsibility as a farmer is to replace the coyote or the wolf and see to it that the health of the flock is maintained by the weakest of them not living. That's part of the arrangement. It's what I would call a covenant. And it's very hard on the human soul to understand that part of your responsibility is to end a life that would not work out well for anyone concerned.
So, Remy, what you're saying is the weakest of the flock will die.
Would die in any scenario.
Would die, and so are you open to that, or facilitating that, or
I do
allowing
it.
that to happen?
I'm not allowing it to happen. I do it.
You do it?
Yeah.
How so?
It's called slaughtering.
Oh, okay.
Animals die in our care.
All right.
Yeah. Just as they would if they were a wild flock. But because I've kept the wolf from them, I've compromised their capacity to remain healthy, you see.
Okay, yes.
And this is why large-scale farming has resort to fertilizer, to antibiotics and all the rest, because the flock's capacity to remain healthy is been compromised by the absence of the predator. That's who the farmer of domestic animals also has to be. The reason I mention this is to tell you, when the letters to the editor came in, as I said, the interview was this long, this part we're talking about now was this big. Where do you think all the letters went to? That. And everybody was distressed and horrified that I characterized participating in the killing of animals, the purposeful, mind you, ritual killing of animals, as some kind of spiritual discipline. They were absolutely offended by that. Apparently the only spiritual discipline available to enlightened people is the one where everybody gets to live forever.
So how you were doing this, for what reason? I mean, as a practice, but as an acknowledgement of what? And what did you do with the animal when you slaughtered them?
Eat them for the most part.
So it was for food purposes. It wasn't just for, it wasn't just for a ceremony. It was for... It
was for the entire story that I've just briefly described to you.
Right.
It's keeping up my end, you see.
Well, I would think there would be some honor in choosing the weakest of the herd, because why take the strongest one? So,
well, you'd be
if it's for food,
you'd be a nut to do so, and you wouldn't be much of a farmer. But you know, I'm not saying all farmers would agree with this characterization of what farming is.
Right.
Probably not, and probably most people concerned with animal welfare wouldn't agree either.
But many had issue with you,
of course,
celebrating that as a spiritual awareness and practice.
Yes, absolutely they did. Now, the interesting thing is, in all the poisonous letters to the editor that I saw and was asked to respond to, the people were not distressed at my discussion of what dying people are exposed to, the kind of unnecessary torment and suffering that dying people are obliged to every day in a culture that doesn't believe in their dying. That didn't raise all these letters to the editor. Isn't that something to know? Yeah. It's easier to get upset about the death of an animal, apparently, in a culture that doesn't believe in dying, than it is to rise up in response to the grotesque things that dying people are obliged to endure in the name of being treated in the name of being counseled.
Right. Recently, that is some enlightenment has happened on that front, where Canada and the United States, particularly here in California, the assisted suicide, where they don't put you on machines, and this great crusade to save you, and at the great expense of suffering to the patient. So there's hope. What do you think about assisted suicide?
Thank you for asking, because I was going to tell you what I thought of it, whether you asked me about it or not.
Absolutely.
You know, it's an interesting thing to notice that euthanasia is being considered and legislated in many jurisdictions at exactly the same time that marijuana is being legislated. That's something to notice. That's the first thing. Second thing is, I'd suggest to you everywhere where euthanasia is being invoked as a solution to dying is a place that's been driven there by the realities of refusing to die. Euthanasia is becoming very quickly a death-phobic culture's solution to suffering. And the death phobia is still there. It hasn't been solved at all. And you will find that euthanasia will not solve the fundamental North American dis-ease with death. It will not. It will encourage it. It encourages even now to believe that our death is our death, our personal death that we own and we can do with as we see fit, as suits us. In other words, even our own death is a question of personal style and a place where we can exercise dominion or control. I mean, hasn't the world already suffered plenty by virtue of North Americans' insistence on being in charge? Hasn't it? Isn't it still? And we come to our own death and turn it into another place where we can be in charge. And that's what euthanasia is an expression of, fundamentally. And it will not change when you legalize it. It will not, quote, ease the suffering. It'll whisper instead that you have no obligation to die when you're dying. You simply don't. You can choose when, and you can choose how. And there's no reality to dying except the one that you agree to. Now, I'm not sitting here pretending that people don't suffer madly as a consequence of the, medical interventions and the rest. I was there. I know more about it than most people who howl against it do. And there's nothing in that that's defensible, absolutely. But euthanasia will not end that. What euthanasia, you will find within a generation that euthanasia will be another opportunity for people to will themselves away from the realities of their own dying. There used to be an idea called your time to die, that people would readily recognize such a thing. And although they might be enormously saddened by it, of course, and the rest, still there would not be a lot of argument about whether or not this was in fact your time. There's almost no such thing anymore as your time to die. The whole thing is up for grabs.
What period of time was that when they spoke about that in culture, and what culture was that? Was that back in...
Here, not that long ago.
Really?
Well, you'd have to go back a couple of generations probably.
So when you say here, in America, Canada, North America, so that was in the 1920s, 30s?
Well, yeah, I don't think you put it to a year when these things began to change, but you can trace the change quite clearly.
Okay.
The more evolved and sophisticated the medical technology has become.
So that would be from the 50s?
Probably from the early 50s.
Okay.
Yeah. Since those days, one of the consequences to all this medical sophistication is that we exercise greater and greater domain over the realities of dying. That has increased so exponentially now that you and I live in a time where you actually don't have to die when you are. If you're not ready, we can actually extend your dying, although it's never called extending your dying. It's called more time. But that's a absolute reality today, you see. And more time when you're dying anyway means more dying. And I'd whisper to you right now that this is the principal cause of the demand for euthanasia.
Right.
That people are being asked to die for too long, you see. The consequence of this choice not to have to go through that is to have lost sight entirely of the idea that there's such a thing as this is your time. Not because you've decided, because you've recognized that it's your time. In other words, it asks you for a kind of discipline and a willingness to know things and to be heartbroken by them, not to imagine that you get a vote even on this.
Well, during our talk for the last hour or so here, I've been sitting with great anticipation, waiting for you to drop a pearl of wisdom that would pull all this together.
It hasn't happened yet?
And I think it has just happened. It has definitely happened in that way that we have lost touch. You totally pulled it together, and that is most important, what you just said there, that at one point in time, people used to honor their death before technology came and before great advancement in medicine. And there was an honor, there was a family gathering, there was conversation about that. There was interaction with each other as friends, and there was a knowing of that. And now we have completely lost the knowing of that. And probably that happened back in those days of storytelling and getting together. And the more and more we're on the technological age, not that I'm down on it, but I'm also, the reality is that we're, with advancements in medical and stem cells and prolonging of life and technology, and then us focus so much on technology, we've removed ourselves so much from the core essence of storytelling and truth and simplicity of who and what we are as humans. So this is the foretelling, and this is the be-all here.
It's a fair characterization, but I think only a partial one. We should be, at least I'd like to be careful and not say, invoke the good old days. Okay, because there was a lot of suffering then too.
Well, we have to, no, I'm not saying we invoke it, but include it. Go back to it, bring it here.
Yeah, you don't want to go back to anything. And it's not there to go back to
well,
anything.
no, not go back. I don't, let me choose my words carefully. Include what is possible then and what is now, and let's mesh it together for some possibility today. But to only be focusing on technology and to be in denial of our humanness is not an answer.
I don't think almost anyone in the business that I worked in is, quote, focused on the technology. To be honest with you, that's probably not a good characterization, or at least an accurate one.
Okay.
What's happening there is that the technology, which is in itself not headed in any particular direction at all, but it's employed not by specialists and technicians anymore. That technology is voted upon by the people who want it as well, you see. This is in no way a conspiracy in the obvious sense of the term. Nobody has their life extended virtually against their will. Not on my watch. People were more than willing to opt for more dying, though they never understood that that's what they were doing. What I'm asking you to consider is this: where you have the demand for euthanasia, at exactly the same time, in the same culture, you have a demand for more time. These things are joined at the hip, you see. And I'm not going to talk in terms of solution, but a way towards some kind of sanity that tries to find some way to pry these two things apart again, is to reimagine the idea that dying is not what happens to you. Dying does not victimize you. That dying is what you do, you see. Dying is an achieved thing. It's a human skill, a deeply human skill. It's something to be achieved, not endured. That requires all the learning we were talking about earlier, you see. So it's fundamentally a question of a kind of radical kind of disciplined understanding that life is bigger than your choices, and that there are times when life asks something of you that you're not always on the take. And dying is one of the times where you're being asked of. And a proper and dignified response as a human being when you're dying is in the neighborhood is to ask, what would you have of me then? That is a proper etiquette, you see. In other cultures, dying is understood to be a divinity, a god. And if that were understood in any way in the dominant culture of North America, the first question would be, what would this God have of us then? How might you have devotion in this regard? Not slavery, devotion. How might you choose to honor this particular God? You used the word honor earlier. How might we do that? The time for being able to ask that question is not entirely past, because I'm asking it right now. And I do understand dying to be of that order. Its immensity borders on the divine, it seems to me. And its utter fidelity to life makes it somehow divine among us. And to insist on thwarting its presence and resisting it and keeping it at bay amounts to a kind of sacrilege, frankly. It's a very strong language. But given the mayhem that I've seen, sacrilege is not a bad description of that.
Absolutely. Well, Stephen, it's been a great honor, great pleasure indeed to sit with you, talk with you. I know we only touched the mere surface. Yes.
Not much.
And I know there's so much more, and I'd like to
bit.
invite you back. We'll perhaps do an interview via Skype when you get back home. And
well, I don't do Skype, but I'm happy to sit here.
Okay.
And you know, if the wind blow me in this direction, then I'd be happy to take you up on your invitation.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
You're welcome.
And from the Art of Conscious Living TV, please do take care of yourselves and take care of others.